real quick, if you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. Also, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our YouTube channel at Campfire Cult Pod for free. It'll really help us reach listeners just like you. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other full Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. And finally, if you don't mind, please share, rate, and review wherever possible. Welcome, dear listener, to the Campfire Cult Podcast. From a camper van deep in the haunted woods, I bring you first-hand accounts of chilling encounters with the paranormal. Step into the night and take a peek into the realm where reality and the supernatural collide. My name is Jazz, and I'll be your host. Welcome back, campers. Tonight we take a deep dive into the chilling real-life encounters with cryptids that defy explanation. From the terrifying Dogman prowling moonlit fields, to the Predator-like Glimmer Man that bends reality itself, and not to be forgotten, the king of all cryptids, Bigfoot. So grab a seat, keep your flashlight close, and join me as we explore the strange, the unknown, and the unexplainable. For our first encounter of the evening, we're headed to 2003, where a group of teens training for a cross-country meet stumble upon something terrifying in the Green Hill Provincial Park in Nova Scotia, Canada.
It was back in 2003. I would have been 15 or 16 at the time. It was late fall, and we were training for our high school cross-country team. The guys with me were Liam, Greg, and Jeremy, and my father, Stephen, was the coach. 2 or 3 times a week, we'd go out for long runs as part of our training. One afternoon after school, my dad drove us to Green Hill Provincial Park. It's a wooded area with not much around except a few farms. We were there to do some hill sprints. If you're familiar with the area, there's a spot where we used to stop for spring water. We stopped there, grabbed some water, did our warm-ups, and ran up and down the wooded side of the hill. After that, we went to the south side and ran up to the top, a little over a kilometer of steep incline. The east side of the hill is where the real story begins. At the top of the hill, there's a lookout where you could once see most of the county when a fire tower stood there. After finishing our run, we had about half an hour to kill. My dad told us to spend some time exploring the park. There wasn't much to do, just some old picnic tables and a pond, so we decided to head down the east side of the hill. That side is very steep, densely wooded, and covered with small trees. If you look on Google Maps, it's clear how treacherous it is. While we were familiar with the area near the spring, we'd never gone all the way down from the top on that side before. We figured it would be a fun challenge. We told my dad where we were going, and he reminded us we only had about 35 minutes. We assured him we'd be fine. Still winded from hill sprints, we began our descent. The hill was so steep in parts that we had to grab trees to keep from falling. The ground was covered in wet, slippery leaves, making it even more treacherous. The descent was uneventful at first, just the usual woods noises. We could hear dogs barking in the distance, probably from a nearby farm. But when we reached the bottom of the hill, everything changed. It became deathly silent. No wind, no barking dogs, no rustling leaves. It was eerie. Realizing we only had about 10 minutes to get back up, we panicked. It had taken us 20 minutes to get down, so we were certain we'd be late. None of us wanted to upset my dad, so we started back up the hill, picking up the pace despite our exhaustion. I was at the front with Jeremy, while Liam was about 10 meters behind us, and Greg another 10 meters behind him. The hill was so steep, we had to use trees to pull ourselves up in some sections. It was humid, one of those hot October days where the air feels heavy. About a third of the way up, Greg called out, "Hey, did you guys hear that?" We stopped and listened, but we didn't hear anything. Shrugging it off, we started climbing again. Then Greg called out again, "No, there it is. It sounds like a baby crying." We stopped again, straining to hear. At first, I thought it might be a rabbit caught in a snare. They have an eerie, high-pitched cry. But before we could process it, we heard a tremendous roar. It wasn't like anything we'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a lynx, not a cougar. The roar was so loud it vibrated through our chests like bass at a concert. It came from the bottom of the hill, and Greg, being closest, looked terrified. His eyes were wide with fear. Before any of us could react, Liam bolted up the hill, sprinting past us. The rest of us followed, running as fast as we could. Greg, despite being further down, caught up to us, then passed us in his panic. Suddenly, he slipped and fell, tumbling down the hill. Jeremy tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Greg fell." We glanced back and saw Greg rolling, feet flying everywhere. In the chaos, I yelled, "Greg's dead!" And we kept running. We left him behind, too scared to stop. We reached the top in record time, dirty and scratched from the underbrush. My dad was waiting for us, confused by our appearance. "Is everyone okay?" he asked. Then he added, "I heard someone yell." I thought someone twisted an ankle or broke a leg. We stood there, staring back at the woods, waiting for Greg or whatever had made that noise to emerge. Eventually, we heard rustling, and Greg appeared, covered in dirt and leaves, with wide, frightened eyes. My dad asked, "What was that noise?" We didn't answer right away, still processing what had happened. My dad, an experienced hunter, said the sound wasn't like anything he'd ever heard from an animal. He suggested it might have been some older teenagers messing with us, but as he spoke, a group of teenagers emerged from a completely different path, nowhere near where we had been. On the ride back, we were silent, watching the woods pass by. The next day, we discussed it and agreed the roar didn't match any known animal. Greg insisted something had been chasing us up the hill, and we all had that gut feeling of being pursued. Over the years, we've talked about it and done our own research. The closest we've come is comparing it to Sasquatch or Bigfoot recordings. Whatever it wasn't human, but it wasn't fully animal either. Even now, I can't fully explain it. All I know is that something was out there with us that day.
Up next, a camping trip turned terrifying when a group encountered something unnatural deep in the woods.
Everyone associates camping with the happiness of new experiences and adventures. Some bring cameras, others their favorite hobbies. Our group was camping deep in the woods. What we witnessed there was so terrifying, I can barely explain it even now. We prepared for a good time, some booze and a few mountain trails to explore. I had been sleeping and didn't notice until Mia shook me awake. Blinking away the sleepiness, I stumbled out of the van with my big backpack. We gathered around the adults for instructions we planned to ignore later. Once we settled into our separate boys' and girls' rooms, the first few days flew by. Then came the day we ventured to the local campfire grounds, led by two of the adults. The spot was far from camp, so we had a long walk ahead. We laughed, talked, and joked along the way. A few boys even pulled a prank that made everyone jump. But as we approached our destination, I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was like eyes boring into the back of my head. I always considered myself a skeptic, but my senses were suddenly on high alert. When we reached the clearing with the campfire, we got to work. Some gathered twigs and branches, others prepared food, and a few relaxed and chatted with each other. My group had finished our tasks early, so we went to the watchtower. It wasn't a real tower, just an open, raised platform, but the view was breathtaking. Climbing down, I felt it again, that intense, almost predatory gaze. I turned slowly, trying not to alert whatever was watching me. But there was nothing there, or at least nothing I could see. Shrugging it off, I walked back to the campfire, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. It was broad daylight after all, nothing scary about that. yet the uneasiness crept back in. I have excellent hearing, and every rustle or movement draws my attention. That's when I heard it. Thumping sounds, like something running on 4 legs. I froze, scanning the forest for an elk, a fox, or maybe a wild dog. The thump stopped the moment I did. A chill ran down my spine. "Earth to Dana!" Mia called, snapping me out of my thoughts. "What are you staring at? A bird? An elk?" "Probably just my imagination," I replied, forcing a laugh. She dragged me back to the fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Later, Nick left the campfire to use the makeshift outdoor bathroom. Strangely, he took his plate of food with him. We were all laughing and eating when Nick came sprinting back, pale as a ghost. His plate was empty, except for sauce.
I swear I'm not pranking you.
He gasped.
Something ran past me and stole my food.
The adults dismissed it as a wild animal, but the look in Nick's eyes said otherwise. We tried to move on, cleaning up and preparing to explore more of the area. As we walked along a muddy trail, we noticed strange tracks. They were large, too large for any bear or canine we could think of. Shrugging it off, we continued, but the unease followed us. That's when we saw it, an old dilapidated treehouse. The group moved ahead, but a few of us decided to check it out. We climbed the rickety ladder, trying to ignore the rustling sounds around us. Inside, the air was damp and musty. Nick, who climbed last, suddenly screamed,
"Get inside now!"
We huddled in the back, staring at him like he was crazy.
I saw something huge.
He whispered, trembling. "A bear, right?" I asked, trying to calm him down. He shook his head. Before we could process his words, we heard it. Running, growling, and a chilling howl. It sounded like a wolf, but not just a wolf. It was mixed with something human, a sound of insufferable pain and rage. Peeking out the window, we saw what looked like a massive bear climbing the tree. But the bear wasn't looking at us. It was looking down. Then we saw it. The creature was at least 8 feet tall, with black fur, a long snout, and sharp canines. Its eyes glowed yellow. It moved like a predator, but with a disturbingly human shape. We stood frozen, our minds struggling to comprehend what we were seeing. The bear thing fled, crashing through the undergrowth. The creature snarled and retreated into the forest. Shaken, we rushed back to camp, but even there, the unease lingered. As we tried to calm down, another bone-chilling howl echoed through the night. Peering out, we saw it standing on its hind legs near the camp's barbed wire fence. It sniffed the air, its ears twitching. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the forest. None of us slept that night. Even now, I can't forget those yellow eyes watching us. I used to be a skeptic, but that experience made me a believer. Sometimes I still feel watched, and I wonder, did it follow me home?
Coming up, a man while walking his dog near Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin, encountered an invisible, massive 10-foot tall predator-like creature.
I had a very strange trail encounter with an invisible, two-legged large thing while walking with my dog. Some of the trail sections have wooded areas alongside the walking paths, so most of the trail has woods on one side of the path, and the park is on the other side of the trail. The wooded area is not very large. I would guess about 300 feet by half a mile, so I don't consider it a forest. I just call it the woods. I'm located in northeast Wisconsin near Sturgeon Bay. The wooded area of the park has 3 or 4 small creeks, and I think only one of the creeks has some water. Most of the trees are beautiful and normal tall trees, and some of the trees here and there look like they are dead. There are always people and kids going down there to ride bikes, hang out, and whatever else they do. One day around 4 p.m., I took my female dog, Bertha, for our normal, everyday walk. We had just gotten out of the car and began our walk. We were probably walking on the trail for about 5 minutes or so when I started feeling weird after a turn. No, not scared or afraid. I started to feel happy, and my little pain aches had disappeared. This was very strange because I remember saying to myself, "Wow, I feel good. I feel like a little kid." It was only about 20 seconds of this young and joyful feeling when all of a sudden, something had let go of a large bush that it was holding onto. The thing sounded like it was intertwined in the bush, like holding on and trying to hide. At the same time as the noise in the bush, Bertha turned towards the bush and started going after it. I had Bertha on a leash, and she was dragging me, almost taking me into the woods. I had to hold her back because I couldn't see what was making all that noise. It moved through another tall bush and started stepping heavy with loud thumps. I think it fell when it made it out of the bush area. The thing was only about 15 feet away from us on the other side of the bushes and sounded like two very large horses stomping on the ground. I could see the bushes and the grass moving, but I could not see anything. We moved back away from the trail a few feet, so I could see a clearing on the other side of the bushes to try to see this thing. I looked right where the sounds of steps were coming from and saw nothing. So I looked down at the ground, and I could see where 2 feet were stepping on the tall grass. I remember thinking to myself, no way, that is not an invisible monster. After I said that, I heard something I will never forget. The thing started making loud T-Rex stomps. I recall I could feel the stomps on the ground. Bertha and I were just looking into the woods at this sound. I could feel my eardrums shaking bad, and both eardrums felt like busted speakers. I thought, it's trying to blow my eardrums. The T-Rex stomps lasted about 10 or 15 seconds. Then the sound stopped. It just turned off like a light switch. I have no idea if it jumped into something or if it vanished. It is strange because, after all, that I still felt happy, with no worry or fear at all. Just very curious, I really wanted to see it. On the way home, I remember thinking that any other day I would have been afraid and ran away from it. I heard this thing 3 or 4 times in the following days, in another section of woods. I could hear someone heavy walking on leaves just inside the tree line, about 30 feet away in the woods alongside me and Bertha. I would hear it and I would stop without turning to it, and it would take a step or two and it would stop. I turned around a few times to see nothing because it wasn't moving. I did this a few times to make sure. I kept repeating in my head for some reason, if a person stays on the trail, they have no permission to take you. I think one time I heard his steps in the woods next to me. I thought, I think it wants me to make a mistake and go into the woods towards it. After I thought that I never heard it again. I am sure it can hear what I am thinking. Just a few weeks ago, I saw something very strange related to this thing. Bertha and I were walking in the same part of the trail, only about 100 feet away from my first encounter where the bushes were. I stopped to look into the woods. I was standing still looking past the trees. The area was covered in a few inches of light green grass. I was looking kind of downhill at how the woods go down in and around the creek down there. I thought to myself, it looks beautiful. The trees, the color of greens, and the sunlight and shadow. It looks like a postcard. It's perfect. About 2 or 3 seconds after I thought that, while I was just looking down at this area of woods, I saw a big human-shaped blur move between 2 trees about 80 feet away. I saw it for a split second. It was big, maybe 10 feet tall. Big head, big muscled shoulders. I remember his left knee and the big muscle above it. I could see the thick, shiny hair on the leg. Yes, this thing looked exactly like the Predator from the movie when it was cloaked. It is very weird how my brain was able to capture this image. My memory surprised me. Its shoulders, its head, and the side of its back were reflecting the woods between him and me. I think it took off running because it thought I was sensing that it was in the area, but I had no idea it was there. I think it knows Bertha can't pick up on him if he hides a little farther away from the trail. I am very cautious when we go walking near the woods now. I also tell people where I am going. I have no idea why this thing got so close to me or what its intentions were. And I also don't know why it ran away from me those times. Was there something or someone behind me that startled it? These occurrences were a very incredible time of my life. It changed me in a good way. I often think, I don't know, but maybe that's why dogs are on this planet. To help us and pick up on these invisible things when they get too close. I hope my story helps people to be alert and careful out there in this world.
Up next, in 1980, an 8-year-old boy and his father encounter a massive, black, curious creature.
Back in 1980, I was a kid, 8 years old, and with my father when we saw one. That encounter was burned into my brain like it just happened yesterday. We were visiting my dad's childhood home to see my grandmother. About quarter-mile down the road, one of my uncles was having a house built, so my father and I decided to walk down the road to see it. As we approached the property, we saw his work truck. He kept his German Shepherd chained to the truck just so it wouldn't run off when he wasn't around. What we found odd was that his German Shepherd had crawled under the truck and was whining like it was scared. About 50 to 60 feet away from the truck was a small hill that was dug out for the new house foundation. My father saw it before I did, grabbed my hand and said, "Stop." Right beside the dugout area for the foundation, there was a large tree. Standing against the tree, kinda leaning against it, was one of them. It was big, it was black, it was partially behind the tree, almost like it was playing peekaboo. We leaned to the side to match its movement, then it moved to the other side and stepped out in full-on view. My father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and hauled ass to my grandmother's house a quarter-mile away. Once we got in the house, he told everyone to get in the back room. Him and two of his brothers grabbed their hunting rifles and went back to the spot. They didn't find anything. It was gone. My uncle's German Shepherd was back out from under the truck and barking as usual. My uncles gave me and my father a bunch of shit for making up the story. Ironically, the local newspaper ran an article a couple days after that about people saying they saw some kind of large creature all up and down the river that ran a few miles away from where we saw it. This was a long time ago, so I can't say for certain how big it was because a lot of things look big to an 8-year-old. If I had to put a height estimate, maybe 7 or 8 feet. What has stuck with me all these years was not so much the height, but the width and girth of this thing. It was massively wide. It looked pretty much spot on to the one in that Patterson film. It displayed no aggression towards us that day, more of a curiosity. My father and I talked about it a few times over the years. He always wanted to try and find one again once he retired and had time on his hands. To this day, I refuse to go outside at night whenever I visit my relatives up there. It's hard to explain, but seeing one of these things is a life-changing event.
Next, while hiking the Mount Pisgah Trail, a woman experiences a chilling encounter with a mirage-like human creature moving through the trees.
I have only ever told my husband about this. We are avid hikers, and the Mount Pisgah Trail lot was empty save for one other car. My husband planned to run the trail as I walked it partially, then waited for him at our vehicle, a normal activity for us. I was maybe a quarter-mile from the parking lot, and suddenly the forest went totally silent. I had an immediate sensation of the most fear I've ever felt. It's unexplainable. Never before and not since. A total feeling of dread and terror. I heard brush rustle to my right and reluctantly looked. I saw the area moving as if something was there, but only a mirage type of blob. Kind of like a heat wave in the form of a blob-like creature. An area of maybe 4 feet wide and 8 to 10 feet tall. My eyes couldn't totally focus on that one area, where an animal or being should be as it moved across the forest and out of sight. I don't know what I saw that day, but I know how it made me feel. I never want to feel that again. I think those who hunt these beings are taking great risk. I don't fear wild animals, but I fear this thing, although it wasn't aggressive towards me at all. It just feels like a thing to be feared.
Coming up, while stationed at Camp Lejeune, a Marine recounts an encounter during a training ops mission that turned a once skeptic into a true believer.
While I was in the Marine Corps, we would often feel like we were being stalked while in the woods of North Carolina. It didn't matter how many of us were out there. We were armed with rifles, but no ammo during field ops. Whatever was stalking us would pick up whatever trash or snacks we would drop. We sometimes could see their eyes in the tree line and see random glimmers of shadows through our nods. Military nods are pretty crappy, but you can see outlines or someone's figure. I mean, they were probably used during the early 2000s and they were monocular. Sometimes we would hear knocks or rustling throughout the night, around the Verona Loop training grounds or on Camp Lejeune. Many of us who spent time in the infantry spend about 45 to 60% of the year in the woods. You could hear them at night. One night I was doing patrol ops on the hills and we decided to take a pause. It was around 3 a.m., and we were taking a nap break. It was during a war game, and I was on watch with one of my buddies. Holding security, we were seeing an outline in the woods. And meanwhile, we are sleep-deprived, not thinking we were seeing real things in the tree line, till we talked to each other to confirm what we were seeing through our nods. Pebbles were being thrown at us, and we were confused, thinking we were about to be run up on by OPFOR, opposition force. We wake up our guys quietly, thinking we're about to be ambushed. Turns out we were being stalked. We decided to get into defensive positions, and the rocks kept coming, thinking the whole time we were being messed with by the advisors running around overwatching the war game. We checked on the radio if there were any nearby. None. None at all. So we thought it was OPFOR. We opened up with blanks. But as we opened up, we saw a massive creature and another one about 25 to 30 meters away. The creatures knocked over a semi-thin tree and gave a deep growl, something that would shake guys who were desensitized and not really scared by anything. When daylight came, we circled back to look, and we found huge footprints. We were so confused and shaken. After that situation, we didn't know how to explain what we saw or experienced. That night, I became an actual believer. I was always skeptical about Bigfoot or some creature being in the woods. It was about 3.5 years ago. Till this day, I still struggle to go into the woods alone.
Next up, a one-time skeptic, while in high school in the 90s, witnesses a mysterious figure in her backyard.
I always liked hearing ghost stories as a kid, but never found them scary as I firmly believed that such things did not exist. This view changed during my high school freshman year in the early 1990s when I was living in Montclair, California, which is in San Bernardino County, about a half-hour drive east from Los Angeles. So not some rural or remote area. The house I lived in was about a 10-minute walk from the high school, so each day my mom would take my sisters to school on her way to work and pick them up on her way home. This meant I had the entire house to myself, from about 7 a.m. to about 6 p.m. This incident took place in the afternoon after school let out, around 3:30 to 4 p.m. So not in the dead of night when the eyes can play tricks. The house had no dishwasher, just a double basin sink and a drying rack. So I did dishes by filling one side of the sink with hot, soapy water and using the other side for rinsing. Being that Southern California was literally a desert before the city was built there, we were going through our regularly scheduled California droughts, and everyone had to do their part to save water. For me, this meant filling the hot water side of the sink only about a third of the way, maybe 4 inches or so, and laying the drinking glasses on their sides so they could be completely submerged. I also pulled out and scrubbed every dish before turning on the water to rinse anything. So on this particular afternoon, I was washing glasses and had a few on the left side soaking and 2 on the right side waiting to be rinsed. I grabbed and started scrubbing a third glass when I saw it. Like most houses, there was a kitchen window right above the sink, and this one gave a view into the backyard. My hands were sort of on autopilot as I had been doing dishes by hand for years, and I was just staring mindlessly out the window. What I saw looked like the faint outline of a person, maybe 5 feet tall, walking through the yard. It immediately made me think of the movie Predator, as this thing had a head, shoulders, and torso. The legs were a bit harder to see just from the angle of how I was looking through it, but I didn't believe it was an entity of any sort. I guessed that there was a length of fishing line caught in the wind or hanging from a helium balloon or kite that just happened to be blown into the shape by the wind. Except it maintained the same shape and wasn't moving like it was being blown. It seemed to be moving against what wind there was. It then went under the overhanging branches of a large tree and just sort of stopped there. I was now completely at a loss for what it could be as I stared at it. Presumably, it was also watching me as well. It seemed to be swaying back and forth like a person shifting their weight from one foot to another. I started drying off my hands so I could go out the back door to get a better look. It suddenly took off toward the corner of the house and out of sight from the kitchen window. I quickly went to the back door so I could catch whatever it was before it was gone. But a loud, hollow thump sound stopped me. It sounded like something had fallen or collapsed inside the house. I left the back door and went looking room by room for what happened. I found something amiss when I got to my bedroom. My closet door was open. I have an almost OCD habit of keeping drawers, cabinets, and closets closed. And a shoebox of trinkets that I kept on the top shelf of the closet was in the middle of the room, open and all the stuff inside arranged in a circle around the box. I ignored this for a moment to look out my bedroom window, because when I lost sight of the invisible man, it was right outside that window. I didn't see anything. I picked up the items, put them back in the shoebox, and placed them back on the shelf where they had been. My mind started trying to figure out how it got on the ground to begin with, as it wasn't on the floor in front of the closet, but a few feet away, and off at an angle in the middle of the room. I also wondered how it could have hit the ground just right to have everything in it splash out in a circle and not just dump out in a pile. But I set that thought aside and went back to the back door to see if whatever I had seen earlier was still around. I stopped dead in my tracks walking through the kitchen because the glasses I had scrubbed were back in the left basin. The basin itself no longer had water in it, but the plug was still in place, and the glasses that had been on their side, along with the two that had been taken from the right basin, were now upright, filled completely with water and arranged in a circle in the sink around the drain. This was not something that could happen by accident. It was a deliberate act, which meant there was someone in the house. I reached under the kitchen sink and grabbed a big, heavy pipe wrench for protection. I then went to the back door to find it locked, the deadbolt locked, and the security latch locked. I went to the front door, and it also had all 3 locks secure. I then checked all windows in the house looking for a break-in, and half expecting to see our idiot, drug-dealing neighbor rummaging through our stuff. However, all the windows were closed, intact, and latched. I checked under beds, in closets, and even the crawl space and attic storage area, but found nothing. The whole time, I was announcing myself, saying things like, "Whoever you are, you better come out and show yourself right now." But nobody came out because nobody was there. I was understandably frightened, but once I had cleared the house and found nothing, I was more confused than scared. I grabbed the cordless phone and stuck it in my back pocket, thinking I would call 911 once I found a broken window or intruder. I was getting ready to call 911 anyway, but was suddenly struck with the realization that I didn't know what I was going to report. Someone broke into my house, moved dishes around, and left locking everything from the inside somehow behind them? I went back to look at my closet and look at the sink, trying to find some sort of explanation other than another person in the house. I had temporarily forgotten the thing I saw in the backyard, but remembered when I was retracing my steps. Could whatever it was in the backyard be linked to the things happening inside the house mere moments later? That seemed impossible. The idea that some sort of entity walking through the backyard came into the house and did this was completely ludicrous, but it was also the only explanation that I could find, even though I really didn't want to believe it. That would mean such beings really do exist, and everything I thought I knew about science was wrong.
For our final story of the evening, a hunter's chilling encounter in the Great Dismal Swamp, Virginia, left him shaken for life.
This was about 23 years ago, and I had no clue what a Dogman was, and I didn't believe in anything supernatural back then. I was hunting wild hogs in one of the southernmost areas of the Great Dismal Swamp. This is far south of the wildlife refuge, where it ends at the Albemarle Sound in eastern North Carolina. I had put my boat in the water at a friend's house, about a half hour by water from where I went into the swamp. This was in late November, so it was pretty cold and really overcast, and it gets dark around 5 or so. It was about noon when I tied up and got out of the boat. The first hour or so was pretty uneventful. I was working my way inland. Some of this part of the swamp can be walked through when the tide is low, and it's just marshy with deeper canals and bogs scattered about. There aren't any trails or marked paths or anything, so you really have to pay attention to where you're going, and definitely need a compass since you can't see the sun. It's pretty dark in there, even on bright and sunny days. I was back in there about 2 hours and looking for signs of hogs. I could tell some had been back there at some point, but it had been a while. I got a little further in and started smelling what I thought was a boar. It's rutting season, and male wild hogs have a very distinct smell. It's a musky and kind of fermented smell mixed with old poop and urine. It's kind of hard to explain if you've never smelled it before. However, this was different. It was musky, but more like an outside dog that's soaking wet. I stopped to look and listen, and after 10 or so minutes, I started hearing a snuffling, breathing that came and went. After a bit, I started to hear some growling. I started to get a little freaked out because it didn't sound like a hog, and it sounded big. I stopped again, knelt down, and waited while looking around. Where I was, the brush was pretty thick, so I really couldn't see more than 20 or so feet in any direction. That's when I started seeing movement. It definitely wasn't moving like a hog. It was kinda low, walking crouched down, but not on all fours. I was only getting glimpses of it, and it would stop. It was probably about 40 feet away. This is when I actually started getting scared. I was born in northeastern Kentucky and spent most of my free time as a kid in the woods, camping, riding dirt bikes, and always felt comfortable even in deep woods. When I moved to North Carolina, I fell in love with the swamp. This is the first time I think I had ever felt real and actual fear. I had a Mossberg 590 shotgun, full of 3-inch double-aught buckshot, but no extra shells and no pistol. The 590 also has a bayonet lug, so I took out the bayonet and put it on. I started backing up, not taking my eyes off where I had last seen whatever it was. A few minutes later, I heard it again a little further over to my left. I'm probably about 3/4 of a mile into the swamp, which doesn't seem very far, but the terrain doesn't make for quick movement. This went on for about another 20 minutes while backtracking out as fast as I could. I was still hearing it and catching glimpses of movement, and the smell was getting stronger. After a bit, I realized that this thing had gotten between me and the way I came in from my boat. I started to panic. I tried to get further away from it and head in the right direction. Then I saw it again, and it was standing up and pretty damn tall. It was still back in the brush, so I couldn't really make out any details as it was dark as hell back there. I wanted to cry and run, but I knew that was a bad idea. It didn't seem like it wanted to get in the water, so I started wading through the canal, headed back towards my boat. I started to put some distance between it and myself, so I got back on hard ground to move a little faster. I could still hear it snuffling and growling and moving through the brush, but it wasn't close anymore. I made it back to my boat, soaking wet and freezing, but I thank God I made it out of there just in time, as it was getting foggy and starting to drizzle. I had never been that scared in my life. I made it back to my buddy's house and told him what happened. I could tell he knew something when I told him where I went. He brought me in and gave me some hot coffee, with a big slug of bourbon in it. When I calmed down, he took me to the other house out back of his property, to where his granddad lived. I'd met his granddad before, but he had always been kinda standoffish to me. I found out later he just had real bad PTSD from Korea. My buddy and his family had lived in that area since after the Civil War. I think his granddad's great-granddad had been a slave around there, but that's a story for another day. His family had history in that area and knew the place a lot better than me. After I told his granddad what happened, he stood up, looked me in the eye and said, "Don't go back in there. You're lucky you made it out. That's where the big dogs live." I left and went home and slept for about 18 hours. I tried to forget about that experience and started to believe I was just seeing things and freaked myself out. I eventually forgot all about it until a few years ago, when a Dogman encounters video came up in my YouTube feed. I was curious what the hell a Dogman was, so I started listening to it. That whole experience came flooding back to mind. It was very similar to what happened to me. I started looking into it, and there have been other sightings and encounters in eastern North Carolina. So that's my story. I'm 44 now and still live in coastal North Carolina, but haven't been back anywhere close to that area. I still hunt and love the outdoors and the swamp, but don't go too far in anymore.
That is all for tonight, dear listeners, unless you are a Patreon cult member, where I've got a few more tales to keep you at the edge of your seat. If you want to become a Patreon cult member to get extended episodes and other free Patreon-only episodes, you can sign up at patreon.com/campfirecultpod for only $5 a month. A quick tip for all my Apple iPhone users out there: to avoid the Apple App Store 30% fee, simply sign up from your computer's browser instead of the Patreon app, and you won't be charged the additional fee. You can still listen as you normally would, but again, only for Apple iPhone users. Sign up via your computer's browser instead of the app. Until next time, I'll be leaving you in the dark where whispers linger and shadows dance. Stay wary, sleep well, and beware the whispers in the night. If you have a story to tell, please reach out via email at contact@campfirecultpod.com or leave me a voicemail message at 720-297-8608. You can follow us anywhere on social media at Campfire Cult Pod and online at campfirecultpod.com. And finally, if you don't mind, please rate and review wherever possible.